Yeah, well, welcome everybody. It's lovely to see at least your names popping up, and welcome to our next keynote speaker, who I'm very delighted to be welcoming today. So I will just introduce Grace in a moment, and then she'll be talking for 40 or so minutes. I will give a reminder when it comes to 5 minutes before the end, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. But if while she's talking you have a question that you'd like to put into the chat, then I will record any questions that you do, and I'll relay them at the end. So if something occurs to you midway through, then I'll keep a lookout for that. Yes. So without further ado, so we have enough time. So yeah, I'm very happy to be chairing this session with Professor Grace Dillon. Grace L. Dillon, PhD, Anishinaabe, is a professor in the Indigenous Nation Studies program at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on a range of interests, including Native American and Indigenous studies, science fiction, Indigenous cinema, popular culture, race and social justice, and early modern literature. She's the editor of Walk in the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction, something we read last year in our reading group and loved, and Hive of Dreams, contemporary science fiction from the Pacific Northwest. Her work appears in diverse journals, including the Journal of Science Fiction, Film and Television, Foundation, the International Review of Science Fiction, Extrapolation, the Journal of the Fantastic and the Arts, the Historical Journal of Film, Radio and Television, Science Fiction Studies, and Renaissance Papers. And along with Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, Isaiah Lavender III, and Tyrone Taylor, she is currently editing the Routledge Handbook of Co-Futurisms, including Afrofuturism, African Futurisms, Indigenous Futurisms, Latinx Futurisms, Gulf Futurisms, and Asian Futurisms, with BIPOC, LGBTIQ2+, and disability threads woven throughout, which will be coming out earlier to mid 2022. So that's something for us all to look forward to. And today she's going to give us a talk titled Moozhig-aendum-itchigaewin, Indigenous Futurisms and Climate Justice. Yeah, so I'll hand over to you, Grace, if you're ready to go.
Sure. Moozhig-aendum-itchigaewin, Indigenous Futurisms and Climate Justice. And what I just said is to make, to create, and to generate gladness. I'm basically channeling Adrienne Marie Brown and her ideas of pleasure activism, which I love so much and have had an opportunity to spend some time with her for. I'd like to quickly give a land acknowledgement to the area that I'm from. I know land acknowledgements could be potentially existing all over. I am a grateful Anishinaabe guest in these lands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, Tumwater, Wotlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kayapula, and other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. We work together, hopefully, to honor their ancestors, their lives, their descendants, and ours. Mino ni tabi Moozhig-aendum-itchigaewin, Moozhig-aendum-itchigaewin. And what that means is Happy First Peoples Day every day. And you'll see a prevailing theme of praxis and how activism and resistance is something that is going on every day. Anin to all, I see the light in you. Darjamal and the End of Ice Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption, 2019, reports on the catastrophic disruption involving trips to the front lines of collapsing geo and biospheres, and interview and reports about near-apocalyptic scenarios, about rapidly thawing permafrost, the release of methane into the atmosphere, flooding of coastal cities, the increasing likelihood of billions of people dying in the not-so-distant future, and in the process, his reluctance to even write and publish the book. He knows that one runs through what is called the praise of grief by a Cherokee elder, Stan Rushworth, who spoke of his own father, an excellent diagnostician and scientist, back in the 1980s, worried that we were then at a point of no return. But rather than give in to depression, as Indigenous peoples, we've had over 500 plus years of resistance in many places. Some actually argue that the fact that we are alive is a form of resistance. Rushworth said that even with this certainty in mind, quote, "We have to do our best every day. Even if it all goes down, it's a matter of personal dignity to do everything we can to turn it around, because you never know. You never really know." This Cherokee elder back in the 1980s reflects the stance of the anti-Anthropocene, or decolonizing of the Anthropocene, one that does not deny or is blinded to this potential sixth age of extinction, created largely by man as a geological force, but in spite of that, with dignity and humility, to not give up and try every day to impact as people of good intentions. This is our very meaning of the Anishinaabe, and sometimes I like to joke around that we're people of good intentions. That doesn't mean we always follow through on those good intentions. Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland and United Nations envoy on climate change, in her Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future in 2018, speaks of a decade of meeting with those suffering the worst effects of climate change. Drought-stricken farmers in Uganda, a president struggling to save his sinking South Pacific island nation, Honduran woman pleading for water. I would add to this the 2019 report by Jacob Sakharov about Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, whose attempted migrations to the US for asylum were actually far more dependent on the 4 to 5 year drought that heavily impacted their coffee beans, hit also by a strange new fungus due to that climate change. And their maize or corn, by other factors often stated explicitly. The fact that this report was given to the White House administration in 2018 and covered up until journalists uncovered this in the month of September 2019 indicates already some of the repercussions of climate injustice, as the peoples of these countries are now starving in vast numbers and are fleeing for asylum. As Mary Robinson notes, they come from communities that are the least responsible for the pollution warming our planet, yet are the most affected. Their stories of over a decade made her realize that the fight about climate change is fundamentally about human rights. And that comes up over and over again in Indigenous perspectives about climate justice as well. And securing justice for those suffering from its impact vulnerable countries and communities that are the least culpable for the problem. They must be also able to share not only the burdens, but also the benefits of climate change and climate justice fairly. This, she says, I call climate justice, putting people at the heart of the solution. And I should just add that there's tons and tons of books now written by Indigenous activists about climate justice. and that when we think in terms of climate justice, we think of it more strongly as coming from ourselves and any communities, whether they are BIPOC or they are co-futures with co-evals, like Bodhi talks about so beautifully. There's really this sense of not a distributive kind of justice, handed on down hierarchically, but rather that we center ourselves and that we are working in combination with others. I'll be getting to the red deal that I just love and highly recommend. And there will be a lot of comment about how we are really brilliant scientists and engineers and architects, and a recent discovery with the mounds in Missouri attest to that as well, where when they were able to uncover parts of it, they could not believe how long it had lasted for thousands of years with the method of the way that they were sifting the soil together. And it was pointed out that our dams, our electrical transmissions, our subways, many of the things, bridges that are built today, would not have that kind of lasting quality. Just 2 to 3 years later, this summer, we experienced 109 to 118 degrees Fahrenheit in our coastal and mountainous areas of Oregon, Washington, and Vancouver, BC, or the Pacific Northwest. And I realize, you guys, that a lot of you may be from places where that's typical, but we're usually in the 70s to the 80s, so that was quite a shock. Where our family lives, with most homes not constructed for any form of air conditioning, and quick cooling centers were created for urban peoples who often could not make it there due to the melted parts on our metro rail system that broke down while power outages became the norm in the city of Portland. And so over 1,000 people died just during that short time, while billions of sea creatures were exterminated in the deadly heat that lasted for a week and a half or so in early summer. Last week, Hurricane Ida caused scenes like Holmes and Hammond in New Orleans, Louisiana, both flooded and on fire. And I mentioned this more, it wasn't really being shown on the news that I could find, but my friends are from there and they were seeing this as they were trying to escape. The power transmission grids all went down while the same hurricane swung up into the northeast and flooded the underground subway system, and numerous people, in the hundreds, died as illegally rented basements with no outlet suffered from flash floods. The Midwest experienced deep flooding and tornadoes that drowned crops, and the wildfires of the West Coast, especially perhaps the Calderon fire, that has swept into a tourist hub of Lake Tahoe, created the havoc of trying to escape the flames. In one instance, I was hearing a story personally, again from friends, where school children were hastily evacuated across the street as their own school went up in flames. In the midst of ICUs and hospital beds and medical staff overrun with largely unvaccinated Delta variant cases of COVID, wildfire smoke has also damaged many human and non-human beings. Quote, young kids are getting more and more admissions to the emergency room and the hospital with asthma exacerbations due to poor air quality, says Dr. Miki Sakdeva, a pulmonologist at Kaiser Permanente in Fresno, California. We're seeing more heat exhaustion and heat-related illnesses. With climate change happening, the number of these cases will keep rising. The International Code Red report, released this past August, revealed that temperatures have already risen 2 degrees Fahrenheit, with pockets of 3 degrees already. Reaching 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit makes extreme heat events almost 14 times more likely. As we well know, the conditions of our Anthropocene are experienced unevenly and profoundly shaped by ongoing forms of colonialism, extractivism, and racial capitalism. Anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and anti-capitalism, explored in depth by historian Ibram X. Kendi and philosopher Alex Shotwell in Perspectives and Controversies in Anti-Racist and Anti-Colonial Anthropocene for Compromised Times, and The Red Nation and the Red Deal, Indigenous Actions to Save Our Earth, also 2021. Both suggest that the intensity and scale of climate crises require equally powerful and sustained responses by activists, schoolactivists, and communities working side by side with scientists, artists, and creatives. I should point out that in our language and when I have shared with other indigenous tribal nations, we don't tend to separate scientists from artists. That's one and the same person, but I've separated it here for others who may not be familiar with that. For there is no neutrality or safe place, as there is also not for racism. It is either racism or a struggling day-to-day anti-racism. It is also an anti-colonial and anti-capitalistic struggle. For instance, lithium-ion batteries, which are needed for solar energy and not often discussed or talked about, exist largely in Bolivia and the Congo. They have 70% of the lithium. And then you may be aware of this, but many of us as indigenous communities are aware that Yellowstone, which is stolen land, and we would like to have land back of all national parks, Yellowstone is also filled with lithium, and we're very concerned about the ravages that could take place. And, you know, I just wanted to note, too, that Evo Morales, the indigenous president of Bolivia, the U.S. backed a coup to try to get rid of him. And largely, I think, just as it was for oil and fossil fuel and the places in the Middle East, the U.S. is interested in trying to grab that lithium. But Evo Morales came back by popular vote from protests in the streets as people came out, and they brought him back in 2019. And what is his radical activism? He helped create the rights of Mitsokumikwa, the rights of Mother Earth, back in 2010, and actually implemented that in his country. And part of that then was to not extract any kind of oil. And Hugo Chavez, whose name is just tossed around frequently, although he's now passed away, what's interesting is that he actually had strong links to Evo Morales, and through conversations with him, decided that he also needed to suppress the oil and the fossil industry that was in his country. So he was in the process of working through that and how can we suppress that and not use that. And you won't hear that in US media news, I think. But I wanted to give you just a few examples here, and then I'll go back to, this is the Red Deal. I highly recommend it. Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth. It's by the Red Nation. And Winona LaDuke in 2018 pushed for an Indigenous-led GND. The former Green Party vice presidential candidate inspired us to think about how divesting from fossil fuel infrastructure, such as billion-dollar oil pipelines, like the Enbridge pipeline that we're so busy protesting and working against right now to preserve our manunum or our rice, could be reinvested into building wind and solar farms and sustainable agriculture and reservations. And in fact, that has happened, not only at her place, but also with our nations as well. The Garden River and Bay Mills, we have solar power now that we're using, but we're also conscious of the lithium, which is largely on native lands, that has to be mined in order to have batteries for that solar power. So that's a concern that we have. Indeed, the most radical appraisals of the GND came from Indigenous people. According to the Indigenous Environmental Network, IEN, the GND as is will leave incentives by industries and governments to continue causing harms to Indigenous communities. Before endorsing the Green New Deal, Indigenous Environmental Network called for a clear commitment to keep fossil fuels in the ground, reject carbon pricing schemes, strengthen language on Indigenous peoples, and uphold Indigenous rights, and stop, not prolong, our current exploitative and abusive economic and political systems. And I'll just mention just a couple things here, is to divest, defund police, immigration, and customs enforcement, which, if you think about it, was put in 2003. It has not been around for that long. And in Walida Emerisha and Adrienne Marbree Brown's beautiful, beautiful collection, Octavia's Brood, Walida herself writes this incredible story called Black Angel, that brings in a lot of the travesties of ICE. And what's really important, we feel, for climate justice is that all of these things structurally have to be taken care of. We need to end border town violence, and by that we mean the border towns that have been built up around native lands. We need to abolish incarceration, prisons, juvenile detention facilities, jails, and border security. We need to end occupation everywhere, and we need to abolish imperial borders. So you can see that with Red Deal and Indigenous activists, we're ready to go for it, right? We need to heal our bodies through citizenship and equal rights, free and sustainable housing, free and accessible education, free and adequate health care, free, reliable, and accessible public transportation and infrastructure, and non-carceral mental health support. No more suicides. We have way, way too many of that. Healthy, sustainable, and abundant food, clean water, land, air, end gender, sexual, and domestic violence, end missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples. And notice how all of this is connected, entwined with climate justice. And then to heal our planet and reinvest in our common future, we need clean, sustainable energy, traditional and sustainable agriculture with land back and remediation, land, water, air, and animal restoration, protection and restoration of sacred sites, enforcement of treaty rights, and other agreements. And so that's just a bit, a snippet of it. And Chelsea Vowell, who's Métis, and Molly Swain, they're both Métis. You may know about their exciting Métis in Space as a podcast, and they've done a lot of other things since then. And what's interesting is that a lot of these artists and creatives, automatically we are activists as well, because we're involved in all of this. And so recently in 2020 and 2021, Molly Swain and Chelsea Vowell of the Métis in Space are really pushing on the Back to the Land projects and working with that. And it goes into those kinds of details. So I'll continue on here. Growing up with his Aztec ceremony, rituals, dances, language, and culture, Xuchitl Martinez, the executive director of the Earth Guardians, wrote at the ages of 16 through 19 his amazing book, We Rise, The Earth Guardians Guide to Building a Movement that Restores the Planet. And I often give that to freshmen who are 18 or 19, and they're absolutely blown away by that book. Kathy Jetnell-Kirchner, a 26-year-old woman from the Marshall Islands, and much has been written on her now in terms of Indigenous Futurisms. And I bring this up. Dear Matafele Panem, you are a 7-month-old sunrise of gummy smiles. You are bald as an eagle and bald as the Buddha. You are thunder thighs and lightning shrieks, so excited for bananas, hugs, and our morning walks past the lagoon. Dear Matafele Panem, I want to tell you about that lagoon, that lucid, sleepy lagoon lounging against the sunrise. Some men say that one day the lagoon will devour you. They say it will gnaw at the shoreline, chew at the roots of your breadfruit trees, gulp down rows of your seawalls, and crunch your island's shattered bones. They say you, your daughter, and your granddaughter too, will wander rootless with only a passport to call home. Don't cry. Mommy promises you no one will come and devour you. No greedy whale of a company sharking through political seas. No backwater bullying of businesses with broken morals. No blindfolded bureaucracies going to push this Mother Ocean over the edge. And you'll notice what's really important there is not just anti-colonialism, but anti-capitalism. And this is the portion of radical love and resistance that we bring in. These impacts are felt globally. The Oktru Glacier in southern Siberia, a sacred site for the indigenous and self-sufficient Altai people, as an elder Oleg speaks of it, is the troublesome lack of respect for the spirits or bosses of these sacred places by tourists. And Ida, I think that, places in Hawaii, this may be brought to mind for you. In addition to the physical impact, the visitor's insolence leaves a heavy spiritual imprint on the land. When they leave, it is the local people who must deal with the consequences of their actions. This includes local shamans carrying out traditional ceremonies to restore the balance between local people, the glaciers, the mountains, and Altai. Ultimately, Oleg concludes, climate change is a symptom of people's ignorant actions, upsetting the natural balance of life on Mitsukumikpa, Mother Earth. In the Altai traditional worldview, all natural things, whether plants or planets, bees or boulders, spiders or spirits, are recognized as conscious living endowed with all the functions, feelings, and follies of a person. For Oleg and his kin, Altai is a breathing and sensuous living entity, with which they must keep their relationship in balance if they want to have a good life. If nature is not treated with reverence, reciprocity, respect, and restraint, the relationship becomes compromised, leading to environmental imbalance such as climate change. In the 2012 Indigenous Latinx and Koji Peoples Indigenous film, it's an Indigenous Futurisms film, Gonen Wendua, it's set in a future where a Mamo sends his apprentice after 9 years of living in a dark cave to travel outside of the community, and his path leads to the digital panes of glass from leftover cities that still recite their welcome when he steps closely to them. But Mother Earth is again covered with green trees and blue lakes and rivers, along with the strange vanishings of the city peoples and decaying infrastructures of cityscapes due to climate change and renewal. And the young apprentice leaves offerings of fragments of ocean shells in thanks for the reclamation of the mountains, corridors, and ocean coral reefs, while also collecting medicinal plants to take back to his community. This film, created by the Koji people themselves, centers on the sacred mountain Sierra Nevada de Santa Maria, the highest coastal range in the world, which is considered by them as not only the center of the planet, the heart of the world, but also as the origin of all things. Their purpose in creating this, after such a long period of isolation themselves, was a charge that they felt to warn all others about the serious impacts of climate change coming and already here. And then I actually have a ton of references to different indigenous climate change books. But what I would like to do now is just quickly skip, because I know I'm going to run out of time here pretty quickly, to actually Bronwyn and Carlson's. This is Indigenous Peoples Rise Up, the Global Ascendancy of Social Media Activism. And a lot of us, of course, are working through climate justice with that. And one of these affective economies of Indigenous activism is the pound key SOS Black Australia, Indigenous dispossession and the effective economies of anger. And in November 12, 2014, Colin Barnett, the Premier of Western Australia, announced that up to 150 of the state's 274 remote Aboriginal communities would be closed. Responsibility for funding basic services was being transferred from the national to the state government, something that we see a lot all over the place. Despite being the nation's richest state, a state whose wealth derives almost entirely from the extraction of minerals from the ground, and Alex Wright's amazing book, The Swan Book, really goes into those extractive industries in a very detailed kind of way. While the announcement sent waves of fear and anger throughout the state, it was a comment on March 10, 2015, by the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott, self-stated Minister for Indigenous Affairs, that became what was later described as the trigger needed to polarize a nation for SOS Black Australia, 2015. On radio, Abbott supported Barnett's decision, explaining, "What we can't do is endlessly subsidize lifestyle choices if those lifestyle choices are not conducive to the kind of full participation in Australian society that everyone should have." And I thought what I would do here is, instead of going into that further, I'll give you just a little breakdown of Claire G. Coleman's Terranolius, because not much has been written about that, even though I know many have read it. She, with her partner, and so this is Gwaigwa-jimoan as Shkiki. In Werluma Noongar, Indigenous Australian Claire G. Coleman's debut novel Terranolius, written during years of research and traveling in an old caravan around the continent of Australia, especially in the drier deserts of Australian First Nations lands of today as climate crises accrue, consists of Indigenous futurism stories spun into a final tale filled with Gwaigwa-jimoan, or what we call true history, as we say in Anishinaabe, or as she has said over and over again in numerous interviews, a form of truth-telling. These stories, told from the perspectives of both natives, earthers, and settlers, alien toads from outside Earth's star system, will be for some of us Moozhig-aendum-itchigaewin, a still, open, leaking, unhealed wound. That's Anishinaabe again. Or trauma, open wounds that bleed with the overflowing pain of more than 1,000 cuts. While for some, these incidents will appear to not be possible, must be science fictional, given their cruelty, while some scenes will awaken others, and finally hopefully heal and scar over these already knowings and awakenings to the white fellas' overall treatment of black fellas, whether Mawitsa a long time ago in the distant past, of the past hundreds of years of colonialism, or currently in the 21st century of continued and newly formed ranklings, mistreatment, and severities of life intended to debilitate Australian First Nations peoples with entrenched systemic racial laws and enactments. For us, climate justice is racial justice, is decolonization, or as the Red Nation says, decolonization worldwide or extinction. And enactments that continue to embrace the white fellas, British colonizers' first pronouncement of a Terran empty lands, an empty void to be gathered up freely and occupied without guilt after landing in ships for the first time on this island/continent of Australia. And the novel itself goes back and forth between island and continent. Terranolius, the novel, enters in the midst of 6 to 7 billion humans or natives already dead or dying or barely surviving. Due in part to the faster voyaging of the settler toads' alien diseases and plagues, in some cases well before settlers appear on those lands, so that in most places on Moozhig-aendum-itchigaewin, Mother Earth, natives and their bones and signs of living have already disappeared, and thus support the gray fellas or the gray-green settler toads, that they are simply entering empty land free for the taking. This deceit the settlers take turns at practicing becomes null and void by their own continued efforts to glean, harvest, capture, and imprison any natives they can find. Natives at this point refers to humans. Since slavery has been officially outlawed by both church and government in the toad's homeworld and empire, with other colonized planets already granted equal citizenship, but viewed in truth as subjugated and inferior peoples, while euphemistically presented as peoples that deserve care and empathy and deserving of the rights of being peoples. Distrustfully, this apparent act of generosity is more probably forced into being by an ongoing pressure by other star systems with other empires that the Grey Fellas empire must continually fight, communicate with, and live with. Lessons learned. Communicators do not exist for the natives on Earth, the driest planet they have encountered. Since natives on Earth planet and its incredible heat increased with climate havoc have no advanced spaceships of their own, and communication even between settlers are too long between Earth and the home world, deadly secrecy of the so-called protection of natives or the enslavement of them all ensues. The uncovering of such, at first hopeful, simply leads to more subterfuge, assassinations, and continued complicities. In other words, it's not going to be from the hierarchical. Oh, am I getting
Yeah,
close to
you've
the
got
end
your
here?
5 minutes to go.
I'll
Just letting you know.
okay, all right. The settlers' dependence on these not-people creatures so defined to escape their empire's legal codes against no persons being enslaved replicates Claire's real-world the highly invasive poisonous cane toads overtaking native toads and lizards, with only the science of First Nations peoples able to find these Shire strains, train and enable native toads and lizards by being injected with small doses of cane toad toxins on a consistent basis to then better grapple with the invasion colonization. Settler toads' explosive greed for too much water, misting frequent cool water baths, wetsuits, and extinction after 2 days without water gobble up the resources of their consigned planet. Natives become malnourished and despairing, paid nothing or solely in poisonous toad habit-forming drinks and drugs. Natives' children, too fond of chatter in their own language, good cheer, and harmonious song, like the magpies' unusual choruses, suffer greatly in their re-education as well, hair constantly shorn, while starved into silence and obedience in claustrophobic, overheated prison cells or the boob. Native women's bodies entrapped by paralytic drugs and baby factories, as the slave population diminishes, are torn open every 6 months in a re-engineered DNA birthing of what become more robotic, silent, almost identical children. These few natives who continue to be free, refugee campies, often are persistently sought out, found, and suddenly strafed from the skies by toad trooper flyers. This embracing of truth-telling, and this is the activist part, is creating indigenous futures, becomes paradoxically the very mushkiki, the medicine awakening, first traumatically, then healing. Johnny Starr, an outlawed toad hunted by his own people after walking away from his trooper unit, still bent on massacring many natives in sight, shifts drastically from the typical settler perspective of natives viewed as non-persons to justify these actions of murder and monstrous deeds done to animals, categorized as without intelligence, empathy, mercy, and love, to embracing those natives who, with mutual respect of life of any kind, save him in the desert over and over again. And seeing and hearing this kind of unconditional love and mercy, Johnny Starr embraces natives as his true family and friends. In response, Johnny undercuts the settler toad's philosophy that so often echoes Darwin's descent to man of blackfellows, the contempt expanded to all human natives in this novel as thieves, liars, and having an inability to love and have compassion. Quote, our whole race are a bunch of thieves, stealing a little criminal, stealing everything, just good government, according to Johnny's flipping the script. Jackie turned up blackfellow language for the place of tall trees, in spite of his beating, stripes, and embedded scars as punishment by the masters. gives up his last bottle of water to save the life of an unknown toad. And his generosity leads to a series of rebellions with graffiti signs of Jackie lives, while Esperanza, Hope herself, pushes more deeply into the bush to find and live with the blackfellows, the Australian First Nations, who continue in this far future to best live sustainably and resiliently as loving and generous family-centered communities, exchanging Moozhig-aendum-itchigaewin, respect and esteem.
Oh, thank you so much. How wonderful. I think we would all be clapping if we were in person. Some people are clapping in the chat. But yeah, like what a very powerful talk. And I think I really loved the way in which you demonstrated how interwoven all of these different struggles are. How there is no way to talk about climate justice without also talking about resistance to colonization and to capital. And I think that that's just exactly the way that we need to approach it. Yeah, so I mean, I'm gonna open it out to questions or points from the audience. So if anyone wants to speak, you can raise your hand using the little raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, or you can write your question in the chat, and then I will read it out, or just say in the chat that you want to speak if the raise hand function eludes you. But yes, so here we have a question already from Catherine Dunlap. Catherine says, thank you so much, Grace, for your expansive discussion. I would love to hear you talk a bit more about the integrated conceptualization of science and art in native modes of thinking. Do you think that science fiction could be a useful way to help others to understand this viewpoint? Or is that going to diminish in some way what seems to be a really vital point for making a more just future? Yeah, interesting question.
Oh, yeah, let's see if there's so many things I didn't bring up here, but I'm trying to find this particular one. See if I can find it here really quickly as an example of that centering of Indigenous science. First of all, our own language puts the two together. Writers, artists are put together, and so are scientists. You're automatically a scientist if you're an artist. But what I'm trying to find here is there is a really good example of that with Blackfeet people. And, well, I'll just tell it very quickly then. There's a Blackfeet scientist who came back to his community, and as he was working with quantum physics and string theory and quantum entanglement, they were realizing that they didn't have a language for that at the time. So what they did is they created the language for it in their own Blackfoot tongue. But as they did that, they also had ceremonial dances. They had singing. They had drumming. Uh, they were creating artwork to imagine forth those kinds of quantum entanglements. And it was all done together simultaneously. And that's what Xuchitl Martinez, with his book, it's a beautiful book, especially for young people, because he shows, he plays hip hop himself, and he shows how hip hop music and art are absolutely integral to science. Um, if you think of it, our knowledge bases, which is in our language, say with a plant, we don't simply give one name or follow the kind of Latinate expressions that are given. Instead, we learn the different parts of the plant, uh, parts that are toxic, parts that are healing in certain kinds of ways, parts that are toxic but then can be made to heal. All of that is intrinsic to the language. And so we do the same thing with science and knowledge. We're putting in into our own language the kind of senses of showing the liveliness, the living aspects of, and I should say sciences. I don't like to say science or scientific method because our world is filled with sciences of all kinds. And so we embrace that plurality of sciences and recognize that as being integral to everything that we do. I hope that helps.
I think that that's a wonderful answer. While other people are thinking of more questions to ask, I think that follows on from some of the things I was thinking. I really enjoyed your reading of Terranolius so much. It's a book that I really enjoyed. I think one of the most kind of striking twists of any book that I've read, the kind of the revelation of the science fictionalness of it.
Yes.
And yeah, which is a great part of it. And I was wondering if you could say any more about I guess it's connected to this idea Catherine has raised, which is the relationship that is produced between these the kind of the writing that Claire Coleman is producing, and how what I felt was striking about your reading is that she's going back to that idea of the alien encounter, which is so kind of this very familiar science fictional trope, and kind of demonstrating how central the dynamics of colonialism and indigeneity kind of always were to that, rather than saying, oh, I'm doing a completely new thing. And I wondered if you had any more to say about that idea of how the future in Indigenous futurism, I guess, is always also oriented towards the past. It's not like a clean break kind of future.
And also of our current times as well.
Yes.
Sometimes has been spoken of as the hyper present that we exist in. And yes, Claire, she emphasizes it's the truth telling that becomes important, and that's part of the delight of reading it. And when I first read it, and I thought, oh, they were saying this was a science fiction novel. And I'm thinking residential uh, boarding schools and missions, and all of it is in there. And then when it gets flipped on its head, you realize, well, absolutely, um, those kind of tropes don't go away. In fact, Bodhi has written an article, and I really love thinking about this with co-futurisms, is having to have co-evaluations, that in some ways futurisms, indigenous futurisms, Afrofuturisms, it's not only that we encompass science fiction, but in some ways we eclipse it because of that inherent colonial trope, right, of science fiction. For example, with the alien contact. Uh, and I'm also thinking now of Ambeline Quaimolina's Tribe series. Um, she herself is Pakula, Australian First Nations, and is a law professor and teaches law, but she wrote Indigenous Futurisms in a series. And what she does there, so that's that kind of truth telling again, is that this book that for some might feel like, oh, what an amazingly creative world that's been created here, is really based again in truth telling. It's really dealing with the history of the non-citizenship that Australian First Nations peoples, were not able to obtain. And so in that series, you have way set in the future. It actually has Palaku values, but what you see is seeping back in restrictive thinking that starts dividing and starts tearing apart into sections, those that are citizens, and then therefore those that are illegals, and then those that are kind of in between. And when Ambeline talks about that, she gets into the actual uh, uh, legal codes that occurred along the way and still are taking place, right, despite the Mabo decision uh, that was supposed to get rid of some of the Terranolius kind of impacts. And that this, so it's a kind of shared concern, anxiety, and activism that's needed, and a continued resistance in order to create genuine citizenship and be viewed as citizens and be viewed as those who deserve to have their lands back. So taking the
Absolutely.
land back, that's the important thing.
Absolutely. And I think I find it really kind of wonderful and important. I'm also really like Adrian Marie Brown's pleasure activism, and I think that you've really taken
Yeah.
that kind of combination of insisting on the kind of ways to find pleasure and joy, but also to insist on the absolute necessity of abolition, of land back, of not having that as being a watering down of kind of political commitments, but rather a way to make them possible, kind of intensification, which I think is just really wonderful. Yeah, okay, there's some questions in the chat. Let me go to them. So Joy has recommended Matthew David Goodwin's The Latinx Files for people who are interested in colonialism and the alien. So that's great.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you so much, Joy. That's an excellent example. And by the way, you guys, get her diverse futures. I didn't manage to sneak that in this talk, but oh boy, is that a good book. That's going to, I think, revolutionize a lot of thinking.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, well, great recommendations we're getting. And then we have a question from Francis here. So, Francis, firstly, thank you so much for this wonderful talk you've shared with us. When thinking about the various scales, struggles, and survivals involved in striving for climate justice in the present and futures, it can feel hard to connect our emotions and thinking in ways that are both situated and also more wide-ranging. Everything is by its nature specific and local and grounded, but also we want to bolster our comrades and co-conspirators across the world to share solidarity. So we've got a very international audience in this room, but at times those connections can feel ephemeral compared to the capitalist world system. Do you have any suggestions or reassurances for those of us who sometimes struggle to think with across the different scales of climate justice, who want to be both situated and connected to those different from us? So yeah, a big question there, but any thoughts you have on scale?
It's an important one. Now, the Red New Deal and many others, many other Indigenous peoples writing on climate justice, would argue that it's Indigenous movements that have really become globalized and have become integral to everyone. It's not just Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, or Indigenous people and allies. This knowledge is something that we want to share together with radical love. The kind of radical love where we know that we have differences, but we work through that Anawakan. We have that sense of embracing those differences and having dialogues back and forth. And so that's where I think social media has actually had a huge, huge impact for some of this. The Indigenous Environmental Network is a good one. And yeah, there's so many movements that get captured and bring together people and go on. I think Standing Rock, Idle No More, tar sands, the Enbridge pipeline, even though those have been connected to Native nations specifically, it has brought in so many people around the world. I also think of George Floyd after his horrific death and the kind of solidity that was created with that. And something that I have to admit I agree with the Red Nation in the Red New Deal is that it's not going to be the politicians and officials and central banks and things like that that are going to make a difference. It is going to be ground movements, ground level, and then they say to the left. They add in to the left. But to me, it is, I think these movements are taking place already. You know, already we are in concert. And in the opportunities right before COVID, where I was really traveling around the world quite a bit, Australia and Germany, and I call Hawaii traveling quite a bit too, and just so many different countries. It was fascinating to me, the connections that were being made and protests of climate justice along with racial justice, transformative justice, justice for LGBT IQ2 plus, justice for disabilities with parentheses around the dis. I love Sammy Shock speaking of it in that kind of way. And so I guess I'm encouraged because I see this happening. You know, I see this happening already. And, you know, that's why, well, we niche people are sharing a lot of our sacred stories now and our cosmologies. Just like the Koji people decided to come down and share. There's been kind of a movement of coming together and saying, we need to actually help each other, you know, and that's listening to the animals and the insects and the phenomenological persons like fire tornadoes, you know, that have been created because of climate change. All of those things we listen to and we engage with, and and through that kind of sense of radical love, you know, and resurgence.
Absolutely. How
I hope
wonderful.
that answers.
I think that answers the question so beautifully. And I think, I mean, we should probably end now. Unfortunately, I mean, this is an ever-ending conversation, I think, but so that people have a chance to have a break. But thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, ending on that message of kind of the importance of grassroots international solidarity and that kind of the sense that we're making the future now, I think is so important when we're thinking about how science fiction fits into this picture. So yeah, thank you so much, Grace. And yeah, as I say, I think everyone would be clapping again if it were possible.
Oh, I just appreciate, you know, any kind of thoughts from everyone else. I mean, that is one thing about our word kobate. I'm in a coma grandma, and so I don't only want to embrace all of you, I want all of you to embrace me, and where we're sharing that generationally, that embrace, that kobate, um, that becomes that linkage of solidarity.
Absolutely. How wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Grace, and thank you, everybody.